go ahead and mute your camera and mute your microphone. I will be spotlighting Carl Kenny and Wiley Cash so that they will be featured. And I'm going to turn it over to Carl, and he's going to kick things off. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you to the OLLI family for this conversation. And I was talking to Wiley prior to everybody jumping on the Zoom, and it's very rare for me as a writer that I confront a work that inspires me to become a better writer. And so I want to thank you for creating a work that adds to the way I think about life and love and what it means to be a part of a narrative that engages in transformation. I want to begin by sharing how I came onto this story. I was introduced to LMA through the music of Peter Sager. So Peter Sager covered Mill Mother's Lament, one of LMA's songs. And what I like to do when I come across a song or an artist is to research beyond that. I consider myself an amateur musicologist. And so I knew of the story, but I didn't know the depth of it. And so I want to thank you for that. Well, I want to begin by asking a question about your inspiration for writing. I note in the book, there's a Q&A section that talks about the fact that you didn't know the story, and that's really quite telling, given your mother shares the Wiggins last name. So I just want to ask you about the deeper inspiration for writing this piece of work, and we'll talk later about some of your other pieces, but I just want to ask you about the inspiration for this work, and to ask more specifically, I want you to discuss the culture that fuels that type of silence, where
okay.
This is a story that is not being told, and the culture that fuels that.
Thank you for that question, Carl. Thank you for joining us today. I'm glad that my book made you, as you so kindly said, want to be a better writer. When I found out that I was going to be with you today, my first thought was, oh my gosh, I hope that I am a decent enough historian and cultural critic to be on the screen with this guy, because I wanted to, hold up my end of the conversation, given your experience and your record of all of your work. But and thank you to Chris and to the OLLI community for welcoming me today. So as you said, Carl, I grew up in Gastonia. I was born in 1977, so I was a child of the 1980s. And I grew up in a mill family. My grandparents were all, on my dad's side and my mom's side, were all born on farms. And then they saw promise in the mills. And so they were part of Ella's generation. Ella was born in 1900. My grandfather was born in 1907. So they were of relatively the same generation. And when people came onto the farms or went up in the hills or went into the lumber camps and said things like, come down to the mill village. We'll give you a church. We'll give you a school. We'll give you a house. We'll give you a job. We'll give you a store. We'll give you all of these things. My great grandparents walked off the farms and the lumber mills and whatever, and they settled in these mill communities. And so both of my parents, my dad in Shelby and my mom's family in Gastonia, were born in mill communities. My dad was born in the Esther village in Shelby, and pushed the dope cart through the mill, giving people breaks. And he, manned the register during, the summertime when he was off at the company store when he was younger. My mom has clear memories of going to the mill with her dad on Sundays, and when the mill was closed, and doing like he did like not janitorial work necessarily, but like maintenance work and things like that. And so this was a culture that I knew that I'd come from, but my grandparents were Depression era people. And for them, the past was not rosy. The past was not something that they repaired to for strength. That their strength and determination was almost like inborn. It had been like burned into them through the struggle. So the struggle was in them, but it wasn't something they were paired to. So they didn't talk about life in the mills. And my parents really didn't talk about life in the mill village, because by the time my parents were coming of age, the suburbs, people are starting to flee. And we can talk about this as well, Carl, given your work. People are starting to flee these urban centers. They're starting to flee these mill villages, and they're starting to go to the suburbs, because the suburbs meant you had made it. You had arrived, right? You'd beat the mill. You'd gotten off the mill owner's dole. You'd fled from the urban centers. And by the time I came along, my parents were living in the suburbs. And I was raised in Gastonia, educated in public schools there, never heard of the Lorry strike, never heard of Ella Mae Wiggins. My mother's father would have been 22 the summer that a woman who shared his last name was murdered at a mill just a few miles from where he worked, and made headlines in every major newspaper around the world. But he never talked about it. People didn't talk about it. And I think there are several reasons for that, especially with me coming up in the 80s. We have a communist-led labor organization coming down south trying to unionize mills. And growing up in the 70s and the 80s in the Cold War, the last thing the school is going to teach you about is a communist-led union coming to unionize a labor town, a mill town. So that was part of it, I think. I think another part of it was that the Lorry strike, while foundational, was not necessarily successful. And so power was never disturbed. And so when power is never really disturbed, it gets to continue calling the shots. Mm-hmm. And so when school boards are putting together school curriculum, they don't ask people like Ella Mae what they want their kids to learn. They ask the people in power, the people who own the mills, the people who own the newspaper, the people who own, the insurance companies, the attorneys, the doctors. Those are the people that are setting the curriculum in schools, especially locally. And then finally, I think one reason that I didn't know about it is because you had Ella Mae Wiggins, who became an international name, it seems like everywhere except for North Carolina, except for the South. This was a single woman who lived in a predominantly African-American community, who was raising 5 children on her own, who was taking a stand against, mill owners and politicians and white supremacy. She was trying to organize with Black workers. She was sympathetic to a communist-led.
Not a really good price.
So all of these
really bad price, in fact.
I think somebody hasn't muted.
Oh yeah, it was $2.50.
But I think all of these things combined to really cause this to be a story that was pushed down. It's something that I never was exposed to until I went to graduate school, and in Louisiana, and a professor from Syracuse, New York said, "Oh, you're from Gastonia, home of the Lorry Mill strike."
Yeah.
And that's how I learned about it.
Okay. Amazing. So what I want to do is I want to have conversation. I want to get into a conversation about the relationships within the book. So I want you to dig into how you develop the characters and the relationships with each other. And so I'm just going to go through a grouping of relationships.
Sure. Yeah.
Talk about.
Nobody's ever done that before. This is exciting.
Yeah. Well, it's the writer in me. The relationship between Ella and Violet. Can you talk to me about how that develops?
Sure. So when the novel opens, for those folks who haven't read it, and I don't want to assume that everyone has, when the novel opens, it's 1929, and Ella is trying to decide whether or not to go check out the strike 7 miles to the east in Gastonia. And Ella lives in a community called Stumptown. It is a primarily Black community in Bessemer City, North Carolina, which is just a little bit west of Gastonia. She works at an integrated mill in Bessemer City, and she doesn't work at an integrated mill because the owners of the mill are civil rights trailblazers. She works at an integrated mill because this mill is the last stop for Ella. She's walked off jobs, she's been fired from jobs, and a lot of mills won't hire her. And a lot of white people don't want to work at integrated mills. And the owners of this mill pay so poorly that white people who can afford not to work at this mill don't work at this mill. but Black people in Bessemer City work at this mill. That's kind of why the mill is integrated. And all of this stuff is historically accurate. Where I could, I maintained the history and the reality of the contemporary moment in 1929. But Ella and Violet was a character that I made up, but I created her character out of a number of relationships that I know Ella had. Because while it would be, hopelessly romantic and idealistic to say that Ella did not see color, of course Ella saw color. She was a product of her time, as all of us are products of our time and our culture. Ella also saw desperation. And she saw financial desperation. She saw existential desperation. She'd lost 4 children to poverty-related diseases, and she lived in an incredibly, cripplingly poor community. And when she looked around, she saw people in similar situations. They happened to be Black, and she happened to be white. But what they had in common was poverty and desperation. And so Ella formed bonds in this community where people would watch her kids when she was on the night shift. She would watch their kids when they were on the day shift. And it was a community, if not necessarily based on visions of equality and, kind of this, romantic sensibility. It was a community based on desperation and uncertainty and survival. And friendships were forged that were real and lasting, and they were fueled not by shared interests, hobbies. They were fueled by desperation and class equality, not racial equality, but class equality. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things when Ella was out trying to integrate the Union, a lot of the white Union members, many of whom were from Appalachia, from the South Carolina upstate, didn't want to be in the Union with Black workers. And Ella said, we have our poverty in common, and our poverty is going to unite us more than race is ever going to divide us. And if we allow ourselves to be divided and therefore weakened, we're doing the bidding of the mill owners. We're not doing ourselves any favors. So Violet was kind of this, this creation, but she's also a sounding board for Ella early in the novel. Violet is her good friend. She knows Ella's pregnant. She knows Ella's boyfriend, Charlie, is no good. She knows that Ella is kind of uncertain about going to the union strike. She knows that Ella's a singer. And as a writer, at the outset of a novel, you try to find ways to share information about the characters without telling the reader information. And that opening scene of Ella and Violet walking home from the mill as the sun's coming up, they're talking about the shared plight they have as working women. Ella's a mother, Violet's not, but as working women. And you're getting a sense of their lives and their struggle in that scene.
Okay, good one. So let's jump to Ella's relationship with Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie was, I kind of did Charlie a little bit dirty. And in real life, Charlie was more sympathetic to the Union than I made him out to be. But what I do know of Charlie is that he was a shifty guy. He was a wanderer. He was violent. He was a tough, mean man. And I actually found an interview with one of Ella's children. That the interview was conducted in 1988 or 1987, and it was one of her daughters, and the woman did not have anything nice to say about Charlie Shope. Mm. And so when Charlie Shope is introduced in the novel, I wanted the reader to know, oh, this guy's a Milltown Romeo. This guy's blowing into town. He's got his guitar. He's gonna romance you, and he's gonna get you into a situation you can't get out of. But Ella, even though she knows that, she intuits that because she's been around the block, she knows this. There's a line in the book that says she had no softness in her life. And Charlie, however dirty, however crude or judgmental or unstable he was, he offered her the only measure of softness she had. And so when we see people in desperate situations, like poverty-stricken people, and we question their decisions, well, why do you need to drink a beer? Well, why do you need to have a fancy smartphone? Why do you need? It's because everybody needs something that's going to make them feel better, that's going to make them think they belong in this world, whether it's a consumer brand of having an iPhone or a beer on the porch at the end of the day. Everybody feels the need to be delivered at some moment in their day when life is hard. And that's what Charlie offered to Ella.
Okay. I'm gonna shift now to Ella and Catherine.
So Ella and Catherine, that was an interesting relationship to write. So Catherine, the family that Catherine marries into, the McAdams, are based on a real family that started a mill in McAdenville, North Carolina, which is right near Gastonia. Many of y'all probably know McAdenville is Christmastown, USA. The mill used to fund all the lights and stuff. So I wanted to contrast the difference between locally owned mills and mills owned by absentee owners, right? So at Luray, it's owned by the Manville Jinks Company, which is based out of Rhode Island. It's based out of Providence, Rhode Island. But the McAden mills in McAdenville or McAdenville are owned by somebody who goes to work every day and goes into an office and lives essentially on site in the mill. And so because this family lives on site at the mill in McAdenville, if the houses look in disrepair and people are starving to death, they can't ignore that. So the houses are nicer. The people are paid a little better. They take a little more pride in their work. But at Luray, because the owners never see the mill, they don't have to deal with the poverty. They don't have to deal with the death. They don't have to deal with the uncertainty. But even so, Catherine, who has married into this mill family in McAdenville, she feels trapped in some ways. She feels that her life perhaps stopped when she got married. She feels that her life is very claustrophobic. There's a moment where she imagines that a snow, like a glass bell jar, like a snow globe, comes down over McAdenville whenever she's in it, and the real world is outside of this little mill town. And when she hears her husband trying to impress the manager at Luray by talking, rather poorly of Ella May and saying the kinds of things that men say, maybe on the Access Hollywood bus, recorded on live audio. That's kind of how her husband and these guys are talking about Ella May and some of the mill workers as dirty people who deserve what they're getting. That strikes a chord with Catherine because she and Ella both have loss in their lives. And she and Ella, despite their differences in class, are both trapped in cages. Of course, Catherine's is a gilded cage and Ella's is the concrete cage of poverty. But these are two women who are stuck in some ways, who want to do something bold. Now, if Ella does something bold, she loses everything. And if Catherine does something bold, the country club set gossips. And so the stakes are not equitable. But the desire to be bold, to be outspoken, to do the right thing is there for both women. And so they do kind of forge an unlikely relationship, but it's also a relationship that is a lot of lip service. There's a moment where Catherine just gives Ella some money. And says, here's some money. And Ella's already thinking like, what's this money gonna do for me? I mean, what's this gonna mean? I'm glad to have it. I'll buy some food, but like, in the long run, it's not you throwing money at me that's going to make much of a difference. It's convincing people like your husband to take a stand against the manager at this mill, and he's not willing to do that.
Yeah. So let's move to that because that's the interesting point. I love the dynamics between Richard and Catherine.
Yeah.
Especially in the visit. But talk about that relationship.
So Richard and Catherine he's the husband who owns and manages the mill over at McAdenville. And he's a veteran, he's a father, His daughter is having an engagement party on the evening when we meet him, and they're at the City Club in Gastonia, the old City Club, and he wants to impress his future son-in-law's family. They live on a plantation down east outside of Wilmington. And we have to keep in mind that in 1929, much of the state's economic power is still centered, kind of Raleigh east. And so this plantation family has come to Gastonia, which is a very rural, mill town. There's this strike going on. There's communists in town. They're trying to integrate. And so Richard is really struggling to put a shine on Gastonia, and also to make clear that his people, he calls them his people, at his mill are not like these ruffians at the Luray mill, that his people. And what I was trying to do there was to draw at least some kind of distinction or some kind of similarity between the way that plantation owners would talk about their people, right? Even post-emancipation, my woman who cleans the house, my man who does this, or my man who tends to the car. I spent a lot of time in Southwest Louisiana, and there's still that talk. My woman will take care of that. So I wanted to kind of build some similarities between class structures, despite race. That some of these mill employees, they were given little houses to live in, just like in some ways the plantation system. They were given different ways to be locked in one place with no hope of ever leaving, which is also, once slavery ends, although it didn't end for many decades, especially in the South with things like convict labor and peonage systems and things like that. But sharecropping and tenant farming was one way to kind of keep people where they were, to keep your people. And the mill village was another way to keep your people. And so, Richard is caught up in trying to keep up with the new in-laws from down east who are old plantation money, and they're just kind of dripping with, Southern refinement. And his wife sees him for what he is. She sees him as a man who is not as bold as she would like him to be, who is not as hopeful or as intrinsically kind as he was when she met him. And so part of the novel, at least one section or two chapters, is about these people trying to find their way back to each other. And Catherine essentially presents Ella to Richard, and later a man named Hampton Haywood, who's a Black organizer from up north. If you help these people and you do it genuinely, out of the kindness of your heart and in a sense of shared dignity, then I might be able to find my way back to you. And, I don't think Richard ever delivers on that possibility. I think his reasons are more expedient and immediate than that. And he admits that at the end of his section. But theirs was tough to write because, it was tough to write because, no matter if you're making up characters, you're still drawing on, some of myself is in Richard. And that's an uncomfortable thing to remark upon. I think of myself as a relatively outspoken person when I see injustice, but I'm not, am I Ella May? No, I'm not Ella May. I'm not Ella May. I'm much more Richard than I am Ella May. And there was a bit of staring into the mirror and writing a character like that.
Yeah. So I'm intrigued by the train ride. So talk to me about Claire and Hampton.
So that was something that just kind of came about, and I don't remember exactly when that came about, but Richard and Catherine have a daughter named Claire. And she goes to school at the teacher school, the normal school in Greensboro, which is now University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And they are on a field trip to Washington, D.C. And they are coming home from Washington, D.C. And they're in a sleeper car. Claire and one of her girlfriends are in a sleeper car. And they've been in D.C. and they've been getting a tour by Senator Lee Overman, who was a real senator from Salisbury. And he was known for his filibuster of the dire anti-lynching bill. And I want to say that might have been 1916. I can't remember exactly. Forgive me if I'm not getting that date exactly right. Maybe 1918. But he spoke for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and filibustered this anti-lynching bill, because he said that if there are anti-lynching bills in the South, then Southern womanhood, femininity is under threat. And so when these future teachers, this group of college-age women, go to Washington, D.C., Senator Lee Overman, a decade after this, what he sees as a very bold protection of Southern femininity, is taking them on a tour. And they actually encounter Ella Mae Wiggins and a group of strikers who are in Washington trying to meet with a Senate committee about unionization and mill conditions in Southern communities. All that is true. Lee Overman was taking a group of young women around when they did come into contact with Ella Mae, and Ella Mae did go after Lee Overman. And so I was fascinated by that chance encounter of one of the most powerful senators in the country happening to be from North Carolina and happening to be from Salisbury, which at the time was one of the most potent Klan communities in the state. Salisbury had one of the most active Klan sympathetic citizenry in the state. And North Carolina has always been historically an interesting state when it comes to the Klan, because they've always been, historically, a relatively, for the South, a politically moderate state. And I like to think of a place like Mississippi, that if you wanted to get up to some evil, and I'm thinking about Emmett Till and some other events like that, you join the police force. But in North Carolina, you had to join the Klan. And so the Klan numbers in North Carolina were incredibly high. It had one of the highest Klan memberships in the South, in the country, because those public institutions had not been infiltrated by the Klan to the degree they had in other states throughout the South. So the Klan was active here because it took the Klan to get stuff done. But in places like Mississippi or Louisiana, it took local politics to get things done. And so the fact that Lee Overman was from Salisbury felt very pertinent and very relevant. And of course, that makes sense. And Carl, you and I were talking about the Klan marching. I think that was 1919 and down Pennsylvania Avenue, tens of thousands of Klan members. And so Claire is heading back from Washington, D.C. She's seen these strikers. She knows who Lee Overman is. They've had their very romantic story of the Civil War and the fall of Richmond. They've heard about all this stuff. And she can't sleep because all of this stuff is swirling through her mind. And she's 22 years old and she's about to get married into plantation money from down south and down east in Wilmington. And, they call their former slaves their people. And her father calls his mill workers his people. And what is she getting herself into? And she's got this big diamond ring on. And so she gets out of her sleeping car and goes into the dining car in the middle of the night. And she interacts with the porter there, whose name is Hampton Haywood. And he's a young Black man, relatively her age. And although social mores and, the expectations of contemporary culture have dictating rules against interactions like this, there's definitely some flirtation between the two of them. Is it because their post-midnight meeting feels illicit? Is there genuine attraction? Probably yes to both of those things. But Claire is thrilled by it. And of course, I'm thinking about Harlem Renaissance. I'm thinking about speakeasies. I'm thinking about jazz clubs. I'm thinking about the thrill that a lot of white folks of means got from stepping into Harlem and then going back to the Upper East Side, right? And so I'm thinking about Claire getting to have this I'm talking to a Black man in the middle of the night, and I'm gonna go back to my sleeping car with my huge diamond ring and be separate from that world. But for now, this feels thrilling. And then later, Hampton shows up again in kind of what I hope is a surprising twist of fate. But I tried to show that even Claire, while she's struggling with her in-laws' take on race, her father's take on class, is unwittingly inserting herself into what can be perceived as kind of a make-believe fantasy
Right.
of interacting with the Black person in a way that feels safe and private and protected, and nobody's ever going to see this.
Right. Right. So, you know, I was intrigued that Hampton continually puts himself at risk. You know, it's throughout his story in this book, he's consistently at risk. So I want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Sophia, but I want to do it based on the comments that A. Philip Randolph made. For those that don't know, A. Philip Randolph, one of the leading Black organizers that we've ever seen. He actually helped organize the March on DC with Dr. King, great organizer, part of the Socialist Party. So there's a scene with A. Philip Randolph where he warns Hampton to stay away from those white people.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about that, the energy around that, and how the assumptions of white liberals put Black people at risk.
Sure. So there's a scene. So Hampton Haywood is a character who is based loosely on, there were a couple of Black organizers that were sent down south to Gastonia to help organize Black workers and get them to join the strike. And at least one of them was met at the train station in Charlotte by strikers and sent back. And so Hampton, I wanted him to feel South haunted. He's from the South. He's from Louisiana. His father was disappeared. That's the only way that I know to explain it. His father was disappeared after killing a white man who was coming to do violence to the family in the middle of the night in a little sharecropper's cabin. And so Hampton's mother and younger sister, they flee north. And they're not necessarily part of the Great Migration because they didn't flee with hopes and dreams. They fled out of fear, and many people did. But so he lands in New York City, and he gets a job as a sleeping car porter. And A. Philip Randolph, as you said, was a renowned organizer, civil rights leader, socialist. And there's a scene in the book that I made up again where Philip Randolph is saying, you know, he's trying to delineate, and granted, I'm no PhD and historical labor movements or political parties or political movements or any of that, but delineate the difference between the socialists and the communists, especially in terms of white liberals and young women like Sophie, who's this very exuberant organizer. I think when Hampton meets her, she might even be a teenager, and she's very forward. And she is very outspoken in the privilege of her movement, and her status is the wrong word in this instance, but of the ease with which she moves through the world. There aren't a lot of situations where someone who looks like Sophie walks into a social situation and says, how am I going to navigate this? How am I going to stay alive? How am I going to secure my objective without getting myself into trouble? Hampton always thinks that. He's all that instinct to assess, to clock, to gauge, that's with him every day of his life, especially given what happened to his father in Louisiana. Right. Again, he's haunted by that. So when Sophie interacts with him, she's touching him on the street. She's speaking to him directly. She's overly familiar with him. And A. Philip Randolph pulls him aside and says, like, you know, listen, young man, you got to stay away from these people. This is not going to get you anywhere but dead. This is not the way to go about this. And people like Sophie can make demands and they can say now, but people like you and me, we need to make what are perhaps more incremental changes. We have to work within the system. Whereas Sophie and the Communist Party, they want to explode the system and start over. And A. Philip Randolph says, you know, I know better than that. I've been in this world long enough to know better than that.
Okay. So let's press Hampton's story. There's this moving story where he goes back for the picture. Okay. Let's talk about why you chose to do that. And I also want to ask you why, the book is incredibly detailed, why you left out the story of the ride to the train station.
With Hampton and
Hampton
Richard.
and Richard, yeah.
You know, so first I'll talk about the picture. You know, one of the toughest scenes I've ever written is the scene where Hampton's dad is taken off the train.
Yeah.
And that, obviously I'm writing outside of my race and my class, but what I drew from there were several things. A lot of nonfiction writing, a lot of stuff by people like Richard Wright and Black Boy talking about leaving the South and talking about the pressures, thinking about people like Charles Chestnut, a North Carolina writer, and some of the experiences he had, some of the things he wrote, but that constant threat. But then before he's taken off the train, all he wants to do is smell his daughter's hair. And I know I have two little girls and they were very young when I wrote the book, and I smelled them all the time. And so that's why I put that scene in there where Hampton's father smells his daughter's hair before they take him off the train. And his wife is crying because she knows what this means. And the kids don't know what it means. And that's a huge emotion. That's a heavy emotion. And I've learned more through reading necessarily than writing that when you have these huge, heavy emotions, you have to have a physical object to distill those emotions down into, because those emotions either evaporate or they are never fully there to begin with.
Right.
And so I knew that if I introduced that picture as soon as I could, and his dad grabs it, his dad makes sure to get that picture when they flee that cabin with a little bit of paper money, that I could put meaning in that picture. And therefore, if I carried that picture through, I could carry that meaning through. The meaning of their wedding photo, where these two young people against the odds were going to start a family in a sharecropper's cabin in Louisiana in 1905. And the hope that those two people had, and that picture would be carried through, and it would continually remind the reader of not the hopelessness of that hope, but maybe you know, the audacity of hoping for something like that. And so that's why I had Hampton go back for that picture. I wanted Hampton to return for something, to return for his father, to return for his father's relationship with his mother, to return to some kind of innocence he had as a little boy down in Louisiana. And then I'm sorry, I've been saying Louisiana because I had Louisiana on the mind. It's Mississippi.
Mississippi. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then not having the car ride between Richard and Hampton. I've also learned, this is more as a writer than a reader,
Mm-hmm.
really emotionally complicated interactions are hard to put on the page without them being melodramatic. And I knew that it was that moment when Richard is fleeing the city with the black man who is being searched for in the back of his car, that the emotion of that car ride would be on a 10. And I am not the kind of writer who can write a convincing scene with the emotion on the 10, because there's no subtext to an emotion that high. So I can't have them talk about subtext with, I can't have them talk about context with the subtext being a lynching, right? I knew they would only talk about the possibility of a lynching, or the possibility of getting caught, the possibility of what's going to happen to Hampton. And I knew that I couldn't sustain that conversation over the course of any number of pages on that high of an emotional level and make it a satisfactory reading experience. So what I tried to do instead was to make the highest emotional moment that brief couple of maybe minute where Richard is sitting outside of Hampton's house, and the Pinkerton detective and the cops are there, and they're questioning Richard about, like, why are you out so late? And Hampton's in the back of the car. I wanted that to be the highest emotional moment. And then I wanted the reader to wonder, what happened next? What happened next? And so when Richard gets home, you still don't know what happened necessarily. And he has, a relatively involved scene with his wife, and she's asking him, did you do the right thing? Did you do the right thing? Did you do the right thing? And eventually he says, yes, I did the right thing, but not necessarily for the right reasons. That's where I wanted the reader to go. I wanted the reader to understand the nuance of Richard's impulse. It was not to save Hampton, it was to save their family, his family, right? His status, his standing, his job, his life. And so I wanted that high tension, and then I wanted that drop, and then I wanted Richard's the hero to be, kind of skewed a little bit there.
Yeah, I think it was the right choice.
Thank you. That means a lot.
I love the choice. I'm glad you did it. So there's one more character I want to consider, because he remains on the periphery of the story. I mean, he's there, but he's not really, and that's Brother.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about Brother's role in this in the story.
So Brother was a complicated character, the way he appears early on and then comes back. And that's something that I didn't know was going to happen, but I love, I grew up in the church. I was telling you about that. And I'll tell you that when I was an undergraduate, I went to one of my history professors and I said, I think I've decided I'm going to keep going in graduate school, and I'm going to try to be a college professor. And without missing a beat, he looked at me, my professor looked at me and said, Wiley, that's great news, because the worst sinners make the best preachers. And from the tradition I'm from, you gotta have the tale of walking through the fire. You gotta have the tale of being fallen before you can be saved. And I love the idea of Brother having that past and needing to be saved, and then needing to save after he's given this salvation and then this grace that he is given, that he takes. And I also wanted to nod to the fact that there was a religious element to the strike, and I didn't necessarily put this in the book. There were several religious elements to the strike. Many of the organizers were Jewish. A lot of them were Jewish Americans from New York City. Many of the people who aided the strikers in Gastonia were Pentecostals. And that's something that doesn't quite square with our current perception of, the Pentecostal church or the Southern evangelical white church, that they're going to go help a bunch of poor people who are taking a stand in dilly-dallying with communists against rich white business owners, right? We don't see that those two forces as being aligned. But Brother really is like a peripatetic John the Baptist character who just wants to do good. He just wants to serve. And something about the purity in that desire really spoke to me. That Christ-like selfishness, that coming through the fire, that willingness to put himself out there and try to make up for his past sins. Yeah,
I love this character. One more question, and we're going to open up to other people's questions. And it's about the death of Ella. Mm-hmm. It was a beautiful death. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, I wanted it to be a beautiful death, because she didn't have a lot of beauty in her life. And I wanted it to be as dignified as a death like that could be, but I wanted it to be relatively quick. I didn't want it to be, kind of elegiac, where it's this long, strung out death where she's having a lot of time to think. But I wanted it to be something that would resonate with the reader, because you find out very early on in the book that Ella's going to be murdered. And I wanted the weight of that realization to color every perception the reader had of her struggle going forward. And so when that moment comes toward the end of the book, I wanted it to be an impactful moment and not a gaudy, violent, macabre moment. I wanted it to be almost like in some ways, a resurrecting moment. And I've never thought about it that clearly, but I wanted it to feel like a spiritual resurrection takes place, because Ella's spirit, Ella's fight, all that kept going. And brother, puts the chair on her chest, and the chair shows back up later on. And then, Sophia or Hampton finds Ella's daughter. I mean, there's all these things that kind of keep going. And Ella's daughter is still living with her mother's legacy and still parsing it and deciding to celebrate it and embrace it. So as Ella leaves the world, I wanted kind of a gathering momentum, a spiritual momentum at that moment as well.
Okay. One last question. So what's the lesson for today?
What's the lesson for today?
For today.
I think the lesson for today is that, when this book came out in 2017, we were in a bit of a different political moment than we are right now. And, we kind of at that time saw a more clearly an alignment of the haves against the have-nots. That's always the case. But then it felt especially powerful. We had Charlottesville. We had the death of Heather Heyer, where a white supremacist drove a car into a group of protesters and killed Heather Heyer. Well, in 1929, a white supremacist drove a car into a group of protesters and killed Ella Mae Wiggins. And people would often ask me, are you surprised that history is repeating itself? And I think the lesson that I would want to impart today is that history is not repeating itself. It never stopped. It just kept going. The same thing. For something to repeat insinuates that something has stopped. It's caught up with its tail, and it never has. It's just a straight line. We're moving. We're facing the same things that we were facing then. White supremacy. We're facing these exact same things. And yeah, that's the lesson, I think, is that history is not repeating itself.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, I'm gonna open up for questions now, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Great. And there are a few in the chat. The first question asked by Jean Yoakum was, how was the book greeted in Gastonia?
I was a little bit worried about that. I think my second or third event was in Gastonia at the Lore Mill. Lore, several years ago, was renovated into these high-end luxury apartments. And it's beautiful. They've got a little museum in there. They're trying to honor the legacy of the history of the mill. But I was worried. I was worried that I didn't know what to expect, to be quite honest with you. Because I had a lot of interactions when I was writing this book where people would get in my ear and say things that I knew weren't true, or they would, it just felt like it might be uncomfortable. But it wasn't. It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And maybe it just happened that everybody who came, I think we had almost 300 people come to the event. Maybe it just so happened that all of them happened to see the reality of the strike in the same way that I saw it. Maybe that was just chance. But for whatever reason, the reception was pretty strong and accepting. And I don't know that I've really gotten any pushback from Gastonia. And another reason is because the facts in the book are what they are. Like I honored dates, I honored sequences of events. I really did as much research as I could to make everything as true as I could. And then from there, I look at that set of facts, and much like a prosecutor might in a criminal trial, I looked at the fact pattern and then tried to discern intent from those sets of facts. So when these two off-duty deputies, one of whom's been suspended, spend all day at a Confederate rally, get drunk at a speakeasy, and then show up at the strikers' tent colony in the middle of the night without being called, I discerned intent from that set of actions, because those were the facts. And so, I never wanted to write a book that had easy solutions. I never wanted to write a book that had answers. There's no answers in this book. There's just kind of the complications of all the the convergence of all these issues in 1929 and today.
Great answer. Jay Williams asked, the church figures prominently in much Southern fiction as it does in A Land More Kind Than Home, but not in The Last Ballad. Can you comment?
I think that the church as an institution doesn't figure as prominently as it does in Land More Kind Than Home. But I think issues of faith and duty are just as prevalent, and maybe even truer with a character like Brother, who there's a line that says he just wanted to do good. He just wanted to go out into the world and do good. And I think it's especially for contemporary Christians, and especially for those who call themselves followers of Christ, that it really is the impulse to go into the world and do good. Whereas, religion is perverted in A Land More Kind Than Home. Christianity and faith is used to secure power and to be effective and to wield control over people. Whereas faith in The Last Ballad is the people who profess faith are not as interested in that, if at all, in that novel.
Interesting. Simone comments, I was wondering about Richard's PTSD, his relationship to violence. Was that to set him in contrast to the Confederate legacy? Where did you get the idea to give this aversion to him?
That's a great question. I wasn't so much thinking about the Confederate legacy in terms of Richard, but I was thinking that he had been involved in World War I. He had seen chaos and experienced the deprivation of the human spirit. And so to him, violence was a very real thing. And for people to play war at this dinner on this plantation, it just offended his sensibilities of what he knew sacrifice to be in real life. And I also wanted him psychologically to be someone not who was skittish, but someone who was constantly and wholly hyper aware of every situation around him, whether that be a class situation, a racial situation, a situation with his wife or his daughter. He's constantly reading the room and looking around and hearing the music, much like people who do experience PTSD come home from war, come home from traumatic experiences, primed to expect some kind of great conflagration to befall them at any moment. And that's how I wanted Richard to feel. He's someone who never sits down in the chair. He always stands behind the chair, maybe. He's just hyper aware.
Mm-hmm. Great. Suzanne Fetcher asked, do you in your book call into question the moral and ethical underpinnings of capitalism?
I do. I don't think that I wrote a proletariat novel and that there are, complete denunciations of capitalism, because I don't want to just denounce capitalism. I love capitalism. I hope you all buy my book. I love money. I wish I had more of it, to be quite honest with you. But like everything, it has to be regulated. It can't run unfettered, because by its basic design, in its purest form, capitalism is designed to get the most for the least amount in terms of workers and owners, employers and employee. And capitalism comes with the pressure that pushes down. We can make the argument, and the argument is made, that capitalism comes with the levity of lifting up. But in reality, it really is a system that's designed from the top down, not to leverage equality or opportunity, but for the people with the most to get the most by spending the least. That's the basic design of capitalism. And so, like anything, whether it be speech or the right to bear arms, we got to regulate it. We got to watch it. Markets change, technologies change, and we have to keep an eye on these things to keep it as fair as possible. So while I support capitalism, I'm not a starry-eyed believer in that unfettered capitalism is good for everybody, because it's not.
Yeah. Really powerful. I did drop into the chat information shared with us with Meg McCann about the Textile Heritage Museum in Glencoe, North Carolina, that having grown up in Durham, I knew nothing about, and it sounds really fascinating. I encourage you to check it out. There are a couple comments about people who, and their family members who grew up in Gastonia and never knew about the strike as well. So tell us a little bit about your next book.
So my next novel, which is available for pre-order wherever books are sold. When Ghosts Come Home, it'll be out September 21st. It's set in the fall of 1984, and it's my first novel set in the eastern part of the state. It's set just south of Wilmington on Oak Island, North Carolina. And the novel opens when a middle-aged sheriff is in bed. He and his wife are in bed in the middle of the night, and they are awakened by the sound of something passing over their house and heading for a little municipal airstrip on the mainland just across the waterway from the island. And so the sheriff gets out of bed and, against his wife's wishes, decides to drive out to the airport expecting to see an emergency landing or a plane crash or a UFO. He doesn't know what he's going out there to find. And along the way, along this drive, we learned that the sheriff is facing a tough re-election battle. He is, I think he's about 61 years old. He is facing a challenger who's 40 something years old, the son of a wealthy land developer. It's 1984, so the war on drugs is going strong. So this challenger is kind of relying and playing upon these nationalist sympathies in the local community, and to drive out people who are suspected of being part of the drug movement or anything that smacks of that. And the sheriff knows he's probably going to lose. He's been sheriff for 12 years, and he knows, I'm probably going to lose. And there are a number of ways in which his life would be complicated if he does lose. And he feels like he's losing the county if he loses to this guy in particular. And so he gets out to the airport, and at the end of the runway, of this dirt runway, he finds an abandoned DC-3, which is a relatively large World War II transport plane. It's much too large for this airport. The rear landing gear has snapped off. It landed and tried to turn around and take off again, and the rear landing gear snaps off. He arrives and finds the airplane completely abandoned. It's completely empty. The next morning, they fingerprint it. They can't even find any fingerprints inside the plane. And on the edge of the runway in the grass is the body of a local Black man who's been shot dead. And the sheriff knows this man. He knows this man's father. His father is a history teacher at the local high school. The sheriff and the history teacher have partnered on quelling some racially charged incidents. It's 1984. We're coming off the Wilmington 10, just up the road in Wilmington. We're coming off of school integration, and the sheriff has been sensitive as he can publicly be given the time. And again, I'm thinking about Richard McAdam, as sensitive as he can publicly be at the time to those struggles. But he knows this guy who's found dead on the airport didn't have any business being out there. He can't figure out why he was out there. He's a new father. There's nothing that explains him being out there. There's nothing that explains this abandoned airplane. And so that's the setup for the novel, that is about memory and fatherhood and race and time and the struggle to do the right thing when you know that doing the right thing is going to pull the house of cards down around you.
And how long do we have to wait till we reach the end of the story? It's coming out.
It'll be out September 21st. You can pre-order it now at Regulator there in Durham, or Quail Ridge in Raleigh, or Flyleaf in Chapel Hill, or wherever it is that you get your books from. And if you pre-order it, it'll probably arrive before publication day in your mailbox or at the store, and they'll call you.
Excellent, excellent. Carl, do you have the last word? Do you want to ask another question?
My final word is, I read the book also as a love story. Hampton and Violet.
Sure.
That to me was the good news of this other book, is that he was able to rescue her from that life.
Sure, and I think that and let me say, Carl, also in closing here, this book came out in 2017. This is the best event I've done. But your questions were just fantastic. But I wanted it to end with that note of hope, because I think you're right in that Hampton does rescue Violet from this kind of life of being stuck in the mills. And there's that old short story, Life in the Mills, by Rebecca Harding Davis. I think it's called Life in the Iron Mills. But I think also that, one of my favorite books is Gene Toomer's Cane. That's a book that I'm always like thinking about it in terms of the breadth of what it does. And I'm also thinking about it in terms of knowing I can't do any of that. The design and the execution of that book is a single work. But the idea of that circularity, there's a line, something like the road to Africa is a goat path in the South, or something like that. So I'm thinking about Hampton taking this circular route back to the South and having Violet kind of be that corridor, that doorway back to an experience he left behind, which may be more spiritually close to him than life in New York, or may sustain him more in the ways that I think Sparta, Georgia may have sustained Gene Toomer more than Harlem did, or Arizona, or wherever he went after he, kind of went, did very experimental things. So I think it is a love story, and I've never thought about it that clearly. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Enjoyed.
Thank you, Wiley and
so much,
Carl,
everybody.
for a riveting conversation. We're grateful to both of you, and blessings on your journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carl.
Peace. Be in touch.